Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of the People and Dance Floors podcast. I'm actually joined today by all the core members of the People and Dance Floors project. So I'm really pleased to have you all in the room. And it's Eve, Anthony, and Lee. Say hello. Don't
Hello.
be shy.
Hello.
Cool. And so the reason why we're here today is really to talk about a paper that we recently wrote, which is now being published in the International Journal of Drug Policy, but it's beyond the paywall and it's also in sociologies. So we thought we'd make it, we'd come and open up discussion that is accessible, as well as tell you a bit more about the impetus for the paper and our reasoning behind it and what we wanted to do with it. So yeah, that's really the point of today's discussion. And to do that, first of all, I wanted to give you a bit of background on the People and Dance First project, which I don't know if we've done so far in any of these podcasts. And that's actually how we started the paper, is to kind of give it the backstory to People and Dance First, what we wanted to do with it and why we're doing it. I think first of all, we should say it started because all of us, that joined the project at different points in time, all of us are recreational or non-recreational drug users, have experiences of using drugs, and that kind of using drugs was in some way part of our identity or part of our experience anyway. So we felt that while we were asking people to go on camera and talk about their experiences with drugs and dance floors, that it wasn't really fair to just have them talk and not have um, us talk about our experiences and reflect on our experiences. It wouldn't be fair from the point of view of our politics, of our positionality, and maybe our ethical stance. So I think, we decided that we should also turn the camera on ourselves, or turn the lens on ourselves. So that was part of the point of writing the paper. And I think, the point of People and Dance Floors more broadly is to tackle and address the stigma and the taboo around drug using people, and to uh, maybe get away from the mainstream discussions that we have about drugs, which tend to be related to harm, tend to be related to the negative, and either that or the kind of positive discussions are often hidden. They are had, those discussions, they are engaged with, but usually in private, usually amongst friends, usually not in a place where they become accessible to people. And so we thought they were important to discussions to have in public, and not just because they're positive, but also because they could maybe, you know these discussions can be more nuanced. Maybe there is the positive and the negative, and that's a good thing. So yeah, so I think mainly that's the kind of point of this project, is to open up this realm, this domain that is usually in private, that is usually hidden, that is taboo, and that we don't talk about, and make it more public, accessible, uh, open. So yeah, so that's that really. So that was my little introduction, and now I'm just really going to open it up to discussion by asking my team, our team, to why is it that you got involved in writing this paper? What was it that what was it that convinced you that it would be a good idea to write this paper about our own experiences of being drug users, as well as other things, professionals, and you know human beings, but also using drugs.
Who wants to go first?
I think as a general point, I think what we all seem to have in common is something about just excluded voices generally. Beyond this particular example, the role of the public academic is also always supposed to have been to shine light into dark areas and to give voice to people excluded from public debate or areas of research that is currently under examined and all of this sort of stuff. So I think there's a kind of meta approach to this, which is, this is another area that isn't explored enough. And and for me personally, I mean, I've always been somewhat antagonistic to academia, where people don't practice what they preach, and what have you, and this dissonance, cognitive dissonance between the objective researcher and the subjective of research. And I think it's particularly problematic if it's not dealt with carefully, insofar as you become completely subjective and therefore lose anchor to anything outside your experience. But what I think's been interesting and compelling for me to get involved in this is that it's an intersubjective, and we write about this in the paper. We're sharing each other's views, we're seeing behind each other's eyes, and in the same way we do with each other as we have done with the people in the project as a whole. So it's not just a kind of solipsistic me, it's comparing each other's experience and discussing differences of opinion about the issues surrounding the area.
It's quite interesting because some of the debates, and like you say, that discussion that happened without having that initial stage of openness and articulation, like we would never have got to a space where we were even considering alternative perspectives of X, Y, or Z. That it really does, it went against what I felt as common sense or just natural way of being, researching and writing. It really kind of, like I say, it doesn't feel like a very brave thing to have done, even though potentially it may have been. But it feels like a natural way to talk and discuss and be, I think, and be and do research. So it always just felt like a natural thing. Yeah.
I think that for me, it was two things about wanting to get involved in writing the paper. On the one hand, it was a good chance to air my dirty laundry in public, in the most public and least perhaps appropriate of places that I've experienced throughout my life, which is in my actual job in academia, and bringing those two spheres, the drug sphere and the raving sphere and the academic side of things together in a way that I've always found really, really uncomfortable, and has become more uncomfortable as I've gone through into a kind of, from a PhD student life to a more better established, let's say, kind of academic. The idea that certain elements of my identity, particularly around drug use, have to be necessarily downplayed when you're in certain rooms with certain people is fine to an extent, but I don't necessarily think it's sustainable in the long term, mentally speaking, in terms of health and all that kind of stuff. So the project, on a personal level, it was doing that, bringing those two things together, airing my dirty laundry in public, and also getting round the idea that those things need to be kept separate, which I don't think they actually do. And the more that I research as a result of getting involved in this project, the more I come to see that that's not the case. So yeah, personal and political reasons for me, I think.
I mean, one of the things I just wanted to ask relates to this thing that I'm not that familiar with in this sphere of the, when you talk about harm prevention and harm and all of this. And I think, I'm certainly have a different relationship to drugs and alcohol than you guys, because mine's rather more pathological. But what I found what I really liked in doing the film was one of the interviewees talks about the provisions there are for drugs advice. What's it called? The Ask Frank, is it? Something like that. And he makes a really good point where he sort of says, that the harm that I got from my drug use was that nobody told me of the damage you can do to your teeth, as you grinding your teeth and all of this sort of stuff, And it reminded me of a project I worked with on homelessness called, oh bugger, what's it called? Groundswell. And they developed kind of homeless support from the starting point of the needs of homeless people. And the last thing I did with them, they were looking at the needs of homeless people, and the biggest need that they expressed in this sort of survey thing was teeth care, brushing your teeth. And it's like the last thing, you know, a kind of social worker or something would consider is like having clean teeth. You know, there are bigger problems to deal with than all of this. So I think, you know, for me, that you know, within the kind of, if you like, subjective or subjectivities we're trying to give a platform for, you find these really interesting ideas that I think reconfigure ideas like harm, you know, of where that lies and how it's seen, and you know, it's a different thing to see it coming from the people involved as users than it is, say, I don't know, from the police or psychologists or social workers or other, you know, experts.
It really does blow my mind to consider how much we're all seekers of knowledge, of wisdom, of insight. We're all, you know, seeking out, you know, interesting elements. And it just amazes me how much is lost to what is not spoken, how much is made invisible, how much is hidden away, and actually what insights like that has for me on a personal level, what my, you know, recreational drug taking, what impact that's had for me. I can't imagine if you know, accumulate that to every other person that's, and those insights, and if that was all brought up and out and open, what that could mean. It does, yeah, it blows my mind a bit.
So yeah, I wonder if you'd have anything to say relating to that in particular, Giulia, in terms of your original impetus for actually beginning the People and Dance Floors project, and particularly that level of disruption that can take place not just in the subject matter that you're talking about, but also in the making of a film as a piece of activism, and why you would actually choose to use that as a medium to communicate this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I was disenchanted with um, the way in which academic language is so closed off to so many people, for starters, and therefore didn't feel like to communicate the experiences of people and to platform those experiences could be done through a traditional academic project where you write a paper or two or three that not many people read, and therefore that richness of experience is lost, or somewhat lost. And of course it's not lost to me because I'm learning from it, I'm making sense of it, I'm trying to understand it in context, I'm trying to give it life in a different way and communicate my thoughts to others. but but it's not accessible to people. And so the choice of film was to, in some way, cut out the middleman as well, because of course, I will have my musings and interpretations and analysis that I will apply to people's narratives, but that will be mine, and it will be subjective. And of course it comes from my background, it comes from my studies, it comes from my own personal views. But I didn't want that. I wanted for people's experiences to be accessible to people in a less mediated way, which is why, film is, I think, the best channel for that, because it's immersive. It's, you feel like that person is talking to you. And that's beautiful. So yeah, so that's why I was like, Lay, make a film, because I don't want to write about this. I've written enough. And of course, I spent loads of time in the kind of drug policy field, first as I wouldn't say activist. I was volunteering, and I was volunteering around with advocacy organizations, and I was also volunteering with harm reduction projects. So people that organization that primarily deals with the most harmful type of drug use. For example, kind of like frequent injecting of heroin and crack was the main kind of population that I was encountering in my voluntary position. And then I went on to do a PhD, which was all about the use of evidence in drug policy and prostitution policy, two of the most kind of morally contested, potentially polarized, and I guess, difficult domains, wicked domains that exist in policy making. And I don't know, I spent a lot of time, and obviously that whole experience was so enriching for my intellectual journey, but it was also frustrating because well, first of all, because I had to present myself in a professional capacity. I couldn't talk about my personal experience either as a volunteer or an activist or a drug user. None of that came into the picture. And also because I noticed that, if you wanted to count as an expert in drug policy, for instance, you had to be white, middle aged, middle class. You had to kind of be a certain type of person. You had to maybe be a hard scientist. If you were a hard scientist, you were more likely for your voice to count. You couldn't admit to being a drug user. Maybe you could say that you were a former drug user, but you couldn't talk about your experiences as being either informative or life changing or I mean that is, if you could talk about your experiences being life changing if you were a reformed addict, if you had quit drugs and you were now redeemed and ready to take on the world as sober. In that sense you could, but otherwise there wasn't space for current drug users to have a voice in the policy debate. There wasn't space for younger people. There wasn't space for women necessarily. There was a whole, diverse population that was entirely missing from this debate, from this discussion. And that didn't seem fair to me. It didn't seem right to me. It made me feel, like there was this wealth of knowledge that was just being lost. And this was like also more likely to be the people who were being affected by the policies, right? So it's not just, I'm all for diversity, but especially when it's about including the people who are the primary receivers of the policies that we're making. So yeah, so that was basically the impetus or the driving idea behind the project. I was like something that, and of course, I recognize that not all drug use is around dance floors, and not all, drug use is, recreational. And I say it like this because, obviously there's it's a contested term, and some people don't like it, and I recognize that. But yeah, I just think it's something that I I have experienced and feel strongly about, and therefore something close to me, to my heart, to my experience. I want to be able to say something about it. And I believe that subjective knowledge and subjectivity is a good thing, that all scientists, whether they admit to it or not, subjectivity comes into it, whether it's because they particularly care about a subject, whether it's because they have experience of it, uh, whether it's because they're limited as human beings by their own experience and subjectivity. That always comes into it, I think, in any scientific endeavors. So
I
yeah,
think
that doesn't bother me.
that's kind of the connection between the film and the paper, though, isn't it? Is that it foregrounds that degree of subjectivity. And I do think that watching the film, it may have even been cathartic for a lot of the people in it to sort of openly admit and discuss the kind of things that they're discussing in terms of their drug use. I know it certainly was for me, even to write it down and then know that this was going to be published in an academic sort of journal. And I'm writing about, being sold speed by someone that works for a very big and well-respected scientific institution, and nevertheless is very high person quite a lot of the time. But nevertheless, that doesn't mean they're any less functional or responsible or different, or that it just means that's what they do. And especially considering that kind of level of subjective experience in relation to social uses with alcohol consumption and that kind of thing as well, which for me is a big one because I grew up around loads of people that were very heavy drinkers. And for that to be like openly and even respected, even encouraged, right? Where some drug use is like socially reprehensible for most people who will drink a bottle of wine a night and stuff like that, was really one of the reasons why I also wanted to get involved in this project, because I just think that's lunacy. So yeah.
There's a big question on this, because if you remember, Giulia, at the beginning, and we did some workshops and filmed the workshops, and there people just exchanged their stories, and a couple of people who I thought were the most interesting characters contacted us afterwards and said, like, don't put me in it, don't include me. And so the big question becomes this: in creating a platform where you can allow people to express their subjective experience of a controversial subject, how do you, are you then encouraging a particular type of person, of worker, to articulate their particular experience, and creating a secondary exclusion of people, who might have more precarious employment or more precarious life circumstances? So how do we deal with those people who still aren't comfortable enough to speak out, and how do we do that in a way that doesn't doesn't kind of marginalize them? I've just been helping a group in Oxford, a housing group that works with vulnerable people, who wanted to make a film, but the people they want to make a film about don't want to appear in the film, and what they wanted to put them in shadows. And I was like, dude, you don't do that. Don't, so it's this. How do we go take the next step of including voices that are otherwise still excluded?
Yeah, I think you've raised a really kind of interesting point around that. Once we do start to visibilize stuff, the positive and the negative, because as much as invisibilizing the positive nature of drug taking, there's actually identifying the challenges that are not identified because we don't discuss is so much and as important. That the through the kind of anonymity, some elements of that were kind of enabled. But really you come across that second ceiling, having taken that step into creating a forum and a participatory space where people can articulate. Actually, then you've, like you say, Lee, you created a secondary kind of force and like levels of exclusion, and what we have to work with is the kind of toolkit of, I guess, of a social scientist, which is anonymity. I mean, we all felt challenged by the paper. And if I was in a different position, I may have actually decided that challenge was too great and I would have kind of retracted. And I guess it's about developing networks, collaboration, cohesion, and the kind of the community around this project, strengthening that sense of community and solidarity with one another, potentially, that could overcome, or there's a greater than just articulating kind of drug use on camera or through film.
I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot, especially because, well, there's different things. Well, first of all, the lack of diversity of voices in the film. Like, you have, and this was also about the time frame of the project, which was quite quick. So we had to reach out into our networks. So it's a lot. It's a quite a samey sample. It's like 30 to 40 something, like white people, right? Who are, like some people, some working class, some middle class. So there is some class diversity, and I think that's important because I think class, as we talk about in the paper, does mark differences in terms of experience of drugs, but also in terms of how people perceive themselves as drug user, and how fearful they might be about about talking it or identifying as drug users, because they don't have, if you don't have class privilege, then a particular, the working class status doesn't provide for somebody to create a different narrative about being a good or functioning or enlightened drug user. It's usually associated with much more negative depictions, much more it's about addicted or dysfunctional or all of those kind of negative things. And so I think the class element of it, I think we can, and we are already, and we can do something about. But in terms of diversity of things like professions or even like ethnicity, that's more difficult because those who are more likely to be criminalized are in certain professions and in certain ethnicities. So of course they're going to be more fearful about coming out, about speaking or honestly and openly about their drug use experiences. And so yeah, it's really difficult. But I do think that if people who are more privileged, in a more privileged position, uh, start normalizing that discussion, then hopefully that will trickle down and will also push for reform. Somewhere, if we got to somewhere like decriminalization, for example, of possession, that could, also lift the burden of disproportionate criminal attack on Black and ethnic minority groups, for example, and that might open up or encourage or yeah, provide the space for people in those groups to open up and talk in the public domain and so on and so forth. So I think it will take time, but I think that you need some kind of trailblazers, and those trailblazers also need to have privileged positions, need to have if privileged people start talking, then that might have an effect on the ability for people who are less privileged to talk. Like, for example, we know how harsh the consequences might be for teachers who to for teachers to be able to admit to drug use, any drug use. Like, they'll never be able to teach again. So that's yeah.
I mean, I think that the lack of well, no, I think we didn't do too badly given the circumstances under which we made the film. But I'm always minded by a lad I worked with a couple of years ago, and he lived in a caravan in Bristol, like only just working class kind of thing. I mean, really had a and he was he's only a young lad, and he was homeless crack addict, and it was really interesting because he sort of, I was like, and how did you deal with it, blah blah blah, and he said, well, now every Friday night I take some crack, and then come Saturday morning I take some heroin to bring me down, and that does me every week, no problem, da, da, da. And so it was just what strikes me about it is the way that, say, the class positionality of the user carries with it an understanding of how that's experienced. So working class drug users would probably be chaotic or sort of beyond control, whereas middle class drug users, your school teacher or whatever, well, they've probably got a good way of doing it. They're not reckless like the word, so they carry these sorts of connotations.
They're eccentric.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Lovable and eccentric.
Wacky.
It's true. It's true.
Yeah, absolutely.
It goes right the way across, whether it's media representations around drug use or anything like that. It's always the case that, I mean, but yeah, particularly in drug use, when it comes to working class representations in the media, it's never that level of the good old boy or the eccentric kind of highly intelligent person. It's always a symptom of some kind of decay. And moreover, it's a socialized form of decay, because when you're representing this, what you're saying is that these people are a problem, and they're a problem for you and the rest of society as well. And so they are individually responsible for this burden that they then put on society, which is a major shift in what you see whenever you get very small amounts of representation of middle class people in the media also taking drugs. So that's a shift that is, yeah.
We've seen this proliferation of the microdosing, this psychedelic move, this reimagining of recreational drug use for the, like you say, for the middle class. There is this good and bad drug taker. There's this good and bad drug taking behaviour, and I think that's where kind of the project does allow and will always draw in that we're not advocating that it's all positives around kind of this, but actually there's enlightenment in understanding all of those kind of insights, but definitely not, like I say, I felt, and it was a challenge, this kind of, like I say, this proliferation of this narrative shift, and it wasn't a narrative shift that was particularly informed by new knowledge within the community. It was a narrative shift that was fueled by kind of new public discourses, by this being, this changing nature of what psychedelics can kind of offer, or microdosing can do for productivity. So yeah, just very.
Yeah, you know how much that pisses me off, and I always talk about it, and it's like, it's just perpetuating the same hierarchies. And we talk about it in the paper. We talk about how class and cultural hierarchies, map onto each other, and then they are, remade and remade through the kind of, to mainstream discussions about types of drugs and types of users. and we don't want that anymore. We're bored of that. Let's move on to something a little bit more nuanced and realistic even than that. So we open up. We'd love to continue these discussions with others as well. And obviously, I'd love to have discussions with people in the psychedelic community and be like, why do you take the moral high ground? And alternatively, obviously we've been really interested in Carl Hart's work, and the recent kind of um, frenzy and attention that I guess deservedly as received around his talking about using heroin recreationally as a middle class person who's also a professor, a hard scientist. So all of these discussions are welcome, and we hope to have to be a platform for that, and to also facilitate other people's um, uh, voices. And yeah, let's just continue to do that, guys and girls. Yeah.
I think the Carl Hart thing's particularly interesting because someone mentioned a minute ago about, the microdosing thing. Eve mentioned it. And then, Julia, you kind of carried on by talking about, the good drugs and the bad drugs. And I think that those kinds of tendencies also intersect with, lifestyle choices that are much more available to the middle classes in terms of purchasing the healthy, more expensive food and that kind of stuff, and thinking about life worth living in those kinds of ways. So you do these kinds of things now instead of the other kinds of bad drugs. But at the top of the bad drugs list, I think it would be widely agreed across various different sectors of society that heroin's the worst one, right? Don't matter whether it is or not, but I think that a lot of people understand it to be that way. So when you see Carl Hart coming out, not saying I am a drug user, I smoke weed or take cocaine or those. No, I do heroin. I think that was a particularly interesting disjuncture for me, I guess. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even for when you're a working class drug user who is working class but also aspirational, you might aspire to do middle class drugs rather than use drugs associated with like working class or underclass behaviors like heroin and crack, for example. But yeah, all of these things, I really want to talk more, but we're gonna wrap up. So, but maybe we should do more of these. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
More people, more insights. Let's
Yes.
grow this.
yeah,
Yes.
anyone that's watching this or listening to it that wants to come on with us and do a podcast and talk about their own experiences, please do get in touch. All that stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, and
Yeah,
we'll see you
cheers.
soon for another episode. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Take
Bye.
care.
Bye.